Okay. Some of you have asked me about that Pope course next time.
Yeah.
What I want to do is, we have 15 classes. Try to identify 15 sort of major turning points or developments in the history of the papacy. Beginning with Peter and all the conjectures about Peter, you know, where was he, in what sense, if any, was he Pope, etc. And I'll spend minimal time on the very recent popes because we all lived with them. So I will get up to Vatican II and maybe a few words about what's after that. But the few things that occur to me are the Peter thing, Constantine and the imperialization of the church, the emperor and the pope working hand in hand, except sometimes fist to fist. Then the Constantinian period, the fall of the Roman Empire, and then Charlemagne, the emperor created by a pope, and how they brought that off. How could he possibly do that? And what were the consequences of doing it in that funny way? Then the low Middle Ages and the awful popes. I mean, just really awful. You know, they were like, you know, tribal leaders in the worst parts of the Middle East and so on. They had no religious interests. They had no interest in anything except their own personal power.
That's right. And money.
Yeah. And a lot of them, and they got bumped off pretty rapidly, so they're generally short-term popes, but many.
Right.
Then the reform of that, which was significant, but obviously not complete. The colonial period. Well, before that, the conflict between the popes and the nations, particularly France, Boniface VIII and the King of France, and how that reversed itself. The Pope seemed to win, and then he very definitely lost. Then the colonial period and the attitude of the popes towards colonialism, the popes' attempt to divide up the world, to be kind of the world's landlord and give each favored nation a piece of the newly discovered places, and the popes and native peoples and slavery. The popes were very pro-slavery, unfortunately. They got less pro-slavery as time went on, but, you know, sad to say, even in this country, in the abolition period, the church that was least active was the Catholic Church. So the colonial period and the administration of the church in foreign places by the Pope, the thriving of the Inquisition, persecution of Jews and Muslims, and reactions to that. Okay, where does that get us? Yeah, then very shortly after that, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, Luther and the Pope, and then the Catholic response to that, Trent and the Tridentine reform of the Church, which has lasted in many ways right down to this day. This was the most long-lasting reform ever in the Catholic Church. The Papal States, the Pope as a king, very preoccupied with being a king and very much politicized. You know, a nation among nations, the Papal States are a nation, they're going to get bigger and expand and get power and so on. That means a pope with a big army and a big navy, manned largely by slaves. And then the collapse of that, the rise of nationalism in Italy, Italy for the Italians and not for the Pope, and the agreement, the present arrangement, the Vatican State will be sovereign, but it will stay put, and Italy will go back to the Italians. Then the reaction to that, the loss of the Papal States generated a very, very anti-liberal, ultra-conservative reaction on the part of the popes. You look what the liberals did. I think the liberals did more good than anybody. The non-political popes have been the best popes we ever had. But that ultra-conservative thing and the index of forbidden books and the syllabus of errors and you know all these thought control mechanisms set up in the Vatican. no longer the Inquisition only dealing with heretics and schismatics, but now similar things dealing with Catholics. And that meant a cultural death for Catholicism. If you were dealing with philosophy or theology, and to some extent even science, you couldn't publish anything. You had to drop out of the church to get published. And then you'd be on the list of forbidden books.
Yeah.
And then the gradual emergence from that, stimulated, I would say, above all by the Russian Revolution and the rise of communism, the response of Leo XIII to that, and the beginning of the kind of pope that I think most of us always took for granted. Popes who write serious, helpful encyclicals on moral and social and political problems and so on. It's important to realize there were none of them before Leo XIII, nothing remotely like that. Nothing written to the people about how they should behave in any public or moral area of life. So the social encyclicals, Leo XIII above all, but the others as well. Vatican II, maybe something about the popes and the Nazis, the accusations of Pius XII for playing ball with Hitler and so on. Yeah, that's worth half a period anyway. Then Vatican II, what brought it about, what it achieved, what it left unachieved, and probably the last class would be on the aftermath after Vatican II, how have things gone. And that will mean that, very major, very important popes like John Paul VI, John Paul II, will be relegated almost to a footnote because I think we're all very familiar with them. And probably questions about what will come up anyway in connection with other things that they affected. Okay, you get the idea?
Yeah, okay.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, good. Now back to wisdom.
Speaking of popes, no.
I love wisdom. We got up through chapter 10 of the Wisdom of Solomon, and we'll get beyond chapter 10 to chapter 11.
Keeps going.
Guess what? And chapter 11, the last part of the last half of the book of Wisdom of Solomon deals with two big themes. The first one is God's protection of the Hebrews during the Exodus. A lot on that, and presented as a kind of example of God's care for us. We are God's people. He will take care of us, but we got to behave ourselves. And a lot of references to material that you can, almost all of it can be found in the Pentateuch.
So this is just kind of getting me back into it. This is still kind of a reaction to that big long word about the uncaring God, the philosophy that God was impersonal.
Epicurus, yeah.
Yeah, that
Yes.
God was impersonal and didn't whatever.
Yes.
So this is still
Right.
kind of
So
addressed.
this is our God and how good He's been
Okay.
to us and how seriously we need to take Him. Now, what you bring up reminds me that you always have to bear in mind that this book is probably written in the 1st century BC.
Oh, okay.
It's written in Egypt. It's written in a Hellenistic, saturated Egypt, Alexandria, a highly intellectualized city, as it would later be for the Christians. Great Christian theologians were Alexandrian. Therefore dealing with that kind of thing, but the historical references are all to the 900 BC and so on. This guy is nowhere near there, but since he's pretending to be King Solomon, I don't mean pretending in a pejorative way, that's the gimmick, he can't talk about later things. I mean, he can't even let on he ever heard of the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks. So everything has to be put in terms of the Exodus period and all of that. But he's thinking about right now. And therefore his representation of the Egyptians of the Exodus period, and remember he's living in Egypt, is going to reflect what bothers him about the Egyptians now, the Hellenized Egyptians, and so on. You have to keep that in mind always to see why he's going the way he's going. Then in the last quarter of the book, he turns to idolatry. And the whole last quarter of the book is devoted to idolatry. And in many ways it's very repetitious and can be kind of boring, but it's worth reading because you see this guy is really trying to figure it out. You know, where does this come from? Why do people do that? And he actually becomes, to some extent, a comparative religionist or an anthropologist or something of the kind, trying to figure out why people would take to idolatry. He also presents a God who is ultimately nice to the Egyptians, which is now home. This guy lives in Egypt. So he doesn't want to put out something that says, you know, God condemns the Egyptians forever. So it's a merciful God who, despite the Exodus and all those nasty things that happened, God loves all his people, so you get universalism there. He created the Egyptians just as he created us, and ultimately he was merciful to the Egyptians, and you know, that's why I have a home here today. I guess that's some of the implication. He also has the problem of, remember, if you read kind of hastily in the first 5 books of the Bible, it looks like they just moved into Canaan and knocked everybody over, took over Canaan, and it was, you know, Hebrew land from then on. But if you look at history, you find now, in the 1st century BC, all those Canaanites are still right there. They were there in the Maccabees. They've always been there. And they're still there now. So he has to deal with that also. Remember, in the Pentateuch, you get all these instructions on wiping them off the face of the earth, you know, killing the sheep and the cows and the kids and the women and everybody. None of that here. The Canaanites, were a problem, but they're God's people too. And so ultimately God was merciful to the Canaanites, and that's why you might have a Canaanite living next door now. So there is a real shift in attitude here. And I think if you read it sympathetically, you find someone who is trying to come to grips with things that he can't come to grips with simply with the equipment provided by the law and the temple sacrifice and all of that. Temple sacrifice is never mentioned in the book at all, because he's in Egypt. There's no temple there. There's no temple in, we don't know exactly when it's written, but it's probably written after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. So that's out of the picture. Very little reference to the priesthood, except to Aaron, and that's because Aaron is presented as a prophet. Okay, so the Canaanites are also into the picture. So the two enemies that he really can mention, because he's situating himself as Solomon, are the Egyptians and the Canaanites. They're the only ones who would come up yet. I say he can't talk about Assyrians or Babylonians or any of those people. And in both cases, after describing them as a problem and bad in many ways, in both cases he winds up saying, but they are God's people too, and God does not despise any of his works, and ultimately God was merciful to the Egyptians and the Canaanites. Now there's probably a little bit of political correctness in this, because the folks next door are Egyptians. So saying that your God is determined to obliterate the Egyptians would not really be good for business. Nobody would come to his store anymore.
Jim,
yes.
How does this reconcile with this, that they're God's people too, but how does this reconcile with the chosen people?
They're both there, and that distinction is there. It's not explained.
Okay.
But, clearly we're special.
Okay.
But these other people are not, hellfather.
Okay.
So there's a kind of two-tier thing.
Okay.
he's having it both ways. And that having it both ways kind of, I think it begins with the idea that ultimately we're all going to come together, you know, all the nations will come to Jerusalem and be one big happy human race. So I think that's coloring this. He would be very familiar with that. So he's trying to have it both ways. It's God is a God of the world and all its people, and God is our God. But the implication is that if these other people you want to really do it right, they should believe. They should accept our doctrine. But as I say, there's very little about temple ritual, very little about any kind of ritual. The references there are to prayer are to personal prayer. Individuals, you know, asking God to do them favors or making acts of contrition or something of the kind, not ritual prayer. There's not much liturgical atmosphere in this. And then that long discourse on idolatry, and it's interesting to see that unfold. You can almost, you know, having a picture of sitting down and starting on his idolatry thing and trying to work it out. In the beginning you can see, why would anybody do this? Why are people worshiping sticks and rocks? Stuff like that. And he takes all the categories. First they worship sticks and rocks, kind of primitive stuff. Then animals, including really disgusting creatures. And the disgusting creatures are the unclean animals of, you know, of Judaism. And after that, she's trying to get into their minds. He said, it's sort of a nostalgic thing, like a father really misses his son who died. And you know, they didn't have pictures, but I mean, we can fill that in, there's a photo. So he makes a little image of him, and he reveres that image, and that revering of it, you know, turns kind of into religion. That's where his spiritual focus is, which is kind of sensible and subtle and perceptive, I think. Then the business people notice this and say, wouldn't you like a really nicer statue of your son?
Carve you one.
So he gets out his Amazon and he sends away for really nice statues. So it's now the idolatry has become a business.
Oh, right.
So I kind of admire him for all of this. I mean, this is a social historian in the making. Very primitive, but he's doing what social historians try to do.
So who's the writer then? Solomon?
No.
No.
It's
Who's
not
the writer
so.
then?
No one
We
knows.
don't know.
Just someone who said he's
Someone who said he was Solomon, but he was 950 years too late.
Too late. You think it was one writer?
That's a good question. I kind of think it was one
the
writer.
way it's written.
Yeah, I think it may be one writer who wrote it in pieces in different circumstances. Because you see it changes of mood and focus and so on in it, which, you know, wouldn't happen if he just kind of took a sabbatical and sat down and wrote this right through. It's I read Greek, but I can't judge Greek. But those who can judge Greek, I'll say the Greek is very good. This is a well-educated man. And Alexandria put a lot of stock in that too. If you put out an ungrammatical Greek document, forget it. Okay, where were we? Yeah, now it's a business thing, and business is stimulating it. And then you also have these monuments to monarchs. A monarch has occupied a new territory, and first they set up a stele or something like that. And later on you'll find pictures of him maybe on the stele or nearby. And then it goes the same way. We are way off here, but our ruler, our leader is way over there, and we worship him. And so an easy move to the semi-divinization of monarchs and emperors and so on. But it really is pretty easy. I'm always perplexed by the, you know, religionizing of politics. Like, you know, when when people announce that this candidate is chosen by God and so on, how could Billy Graham's son have said anything like that? He was not a jerk. And you had George Bush, I mean, saying, I feel that God has called me to this position. I mean, there's a way of interpreting that might be okay, but there's something about it that's close to this. So now we got these statues of monarchs, and once again, the monarch notices the statues around, and his base are having rallies of the statues and so on. So why don't we under it put down not just Caesar Augustus, but Divus Caesar Augustus. Yes. Now you got to remember that in those Roman designations of divinity, it did not mean that this emperor was the creator of heaven and earth or anything like that. He was just one of the big crowd of heavenly celebrities. And when he died, he would be turned into a god, which just meant that he would get to hang with the other great heroes of antiquity. I remember it. Who was it? Not Hadrian.
Yeah.
I think it was Hadrian who, when he was very sick, they asked him how he was. He said, I think I'm about to turn into a god. I hope he said it with a sense of humor.
Something to look forward to.
Yeah. So, that's another one. And then he launches into kind of discourse on the use of creatures. God puts all this stuff out there, wood and stones and things like that. And you can do good, useful things with it. And you can make a boat out of these logs. Why make a stupid God out of them? So it is kind of, God gave us all of this. God gave it generously. We're meant to use it, but not to do nonsense and make it into divinities. Then, I think a big surprise, after this rather sympathetic account of where it's coming from, always lamenting it, these are all sad developments, but then he bursts out into the consequence of unbelief, by which he means not unbelief in his God, leading to just prodigious immorality. And here we get another familiar phenomenon, the demonizing of the other. And this always happens, in every culture. When the other is disliked enough or lamented enough or even feared enough, then the difference between their practices and ours lead them to what? Lead them to almost always at the head of the list are sexual sins and then all the other sins. So drop real religion, or drop God, and everybody turns immoral. And there it's interesting, I think, just to take a look at St. Paul doing exactly the same thing. Where are you, Paul? In one of the most famous passages, we'll find in the Book of Wisdom the idea that making these things and making these beautiful statues and things like that, this kind of aesthetic, artistic approach, should make them go from there to wondering where all this beauty came from. And therefore it's kind of a familiar argument for the existence of God. With all this grandeur and beauty and complexity, there must be something behind it. So contemplation of these material things should lead us to a sense of the immaterial being that created them. Here's Paul saying the same thing. These are the pagans he's talking about. What can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the Creator of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Exactly what wisdom said. So they are without excuse. So they could help it. It's their fault. It's just kind of a hard judgment. For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But what happened? They became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. I think very likely this comes from the book of Wisdom of Solomon. Therefore, what happened? Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served creatures rather than the Creator. For this reason God gave them up to degrading passions. And notice why God did this? Because they didn't get it. They really could have and should have intuited God as the creator of the stuff. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion. It's interesting to see that's at the head of the list.
Always.
And of course this has become a very hot text in the current
Times don't change.
controversy about gays and all. So much for G and L. Men committed shameless acts with men, received their own persons the due penalty of their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious towards parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. So it's a real rant.
Wow.
They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Okay, therefore, you have no excuse. Now that's the Paul thing, and that's almost identical with the wisdom thing. But the curious thing about Paul is Paul goes right on then to, you know, the Jews are applauding while he says this. Yeah, all those lousy guys over there. But then Paul turns on them and says, you're not one bit better. You have the law, you have the God, and you ignore them totally. So we're all in the same boat, and that leads to the original sin and everybody needing salvation and so on, Pauline theology. But wisdom does not do that. But I feel pretty sure, even the wording is so similar. I think Wisdom of Solomon underlies that text. And that idea, which has a long history, that to become either an agnostic or an atheist or something like that leads to immorality. I mean, there's not a shred of evidence for that. I mean, we all know lots of very worthy agnostics and atheists and a lot of really horrible believers. But it's something that a religious perspective inclines people to be ready to believe.
Is it a little bit of social control? Is it somewhat of social control? You know,
Tell me more.
Well, what I mean is that this is what people are brought up to believe.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And that if you're afraid that that's going to happen, it keeps you,
In line. Definitely.
it keeps you in the bounds, like, don't go out of these boundaries. That's what I mean by social.
Oh, yeah, no, the social control is the right phrase, and it's kind of creating a tradition of desired fear.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember, you know, when I was a kid and there was a terribly anti-Semitic and anti-ecumenical mood in the church, that went on all the time. You know, you start hanging around with Protestants, and you're going to be doing the horrible things Protestants do.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
What are they? I wouldn't even mention them.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. You're
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And it's not too distant from, you know, propaganda even about military enemies, you know. And during the Second World War, the Japanese represented as monkeys and apes and things like that. You know, they were nothing admirable about the war, but there were a lot of perfectly decent Japanese. Okay, let's take a look at what we can take a look at about the idolatry thing. Now this, I think, having just read Paul, this is chapter 13, verse 1 of Wisdom. For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. So it's exactly the same argument. And then he goes on to talk about the worshiping of nature and so on. Then down in 5, so again, they appreciate nature, but they demonize nature. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their Creator. Yet these people are little to be blamed. Very different from Paul. Much gentler than Paul. For perhaps they just go astray while seeking God and desiring to find Him. And that sounds to me right, you know. You know, they're conscientious people trying to figure all this out, and they're still figuring it. For while they live among His works, they keep searching, and they trust in what they see, because the things that are seen are beautiful. But yet again, they are not to be totally excused. For if they had the power to know so much that they could investigate the world, how could they fail to find sooner the Lord of these things? So I think you can see it's a much more sympathetic approach. You know, you ought to be able to infer God from the beauty and order of creation. But you know, maybe you don't, and maybe you're trying. Just a few examples of where he thinks idolatry comes from. When a man prays about possessions and marriage and children, he is not ashamed to address a lifeless thing. For health he appeals to a thing that is weak, for life he prays to a thing that is dead. So, you know, people in trouble, people with problems, people with concerns will seek relief from wherever it might come from, and maybe it's that little picture over there on the wall. Verse 8 of 14, the idol made with hands is nevertheless accursed. 15, a father consumed with grief and an untimely bereavement made a little image of his child who had been suddenly taken from him. He now honored as a god what was once a dead human being, and handed on to his dependents secret rites and imitations. Then the ungodly custom, grown strong with time, was kept as a law. So beginning with this little kind of touching, sentimental, you know, relic, it develops into a whole pattern of customs. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that is sometimes how it goes. Now here's the political side of it. They made a visible image of the king whom they honored, so that by their zeal they might flatter the absent one as though present. But then the ambition of the artisan impelled even those who did not know the king at all to intensify their worship. For he, perhaps wishing to please his ruler, skillfully forced the likeness to take more beautiful form, and the multitude, attracted by the charm of his work, now regarded as an object of worship the one whom shortly before they had honored as a human being. So there are different approaches, and I think there's some sense to all of them. And this became a sudden trap for humankind, because people in bondage to misfortune or to royal authority bestowed on objects of stone or wood the name that ought not to be shared, the name of God. And then we get the bad behavior, idle, killing of children, even cannibalism is referred to. They either treacherously kill one another or grieve one another by adultery. All is a raging riot of blood and murder, theft and deceit, corruption and faithlessness, tumult, perjury, confusion over what is good, forgetfulness of favors. Even the rhythm is very like Paul. Defiling souls, sexual perversion everywhere, disorder in marriage, adultery and debauchery, for the worship of idols not to be named is the beginning and the cause and the end of every evil. Now you had no idea he was going there, and I'm not sure he knew he was going there. Then chapter 15, just a few verses after that. But you, our God, are kind and true, patient and ruling all things in mercy. For even if we sin, we are yours, knowing your power, but we will not sin because we know that you acknowledge us as yours. For to know you is complete righteousness, and to know your power is the root of immortality. Down to 7. This is idol making. A potter kneads the soft earth and laboriously molds each vessel for our service. So he's just making kitchenware. Fashioning out of the same clay both the vessels that serve clean uses and those for contrary uses, making all alike. So this was, a pottery maker. He made, trash cans, and he made food containers. But which shall be the use of each one of them, the worker in clay decides. So he puts a little label on it saying, a grain pot. With misspent toil, then, these workers form a futile god from the same clay. So you can do good things with clay, but they do bad things. These mortals who were made of earth a short time before, notice the eschatology here, and after a little while go to the earth from which they've got this clay and made the thing, from which all mortals are taken, when the time comes to return the souls that were borrowed. Now that is very Greek. The body is lent a soul. The body is going to run its course, and the soul goes wherever souls go, according to the particular philosopher. People are mortal, and what they make with lawless hands is dead. For they are better than the objects they worship, since they have life the idols are never had. Therefore, those people were deservedly punished through such creatures. And here we get a motif that's in other wisdom writing, including Apocrypha wisdom writing, and it's in here, but I don't have time to read you a lot of it. God, in his wisdom, will make the same things that reward the righteous punish the unrighteous. And this is sometimes pretty stretched. But, for example, water. God drowns the Egyptians in it, but he slakes the thirst of the Exodus Hebrews. and so with other things. Yeah, the animals come and they bite and sting and kill the bad guys, but they don't bother us at all, because remember Moses had that thing you hold up and sting somebody. The ungodly, refusing to know you, were flogged by the strength of your arm, pursued by unusual rains and half-relentless storms, and utterly consumed by fire. And then we'll get fire that we use to cook our meals and keep warm. So the destructive and the constructive powers of these things.
It was not a rain, it rains on the just and unjust alike.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Not that kind of guy.
So you kind of get the idea of what's going on here?
Now, this is a book that is not in the Protestant Bible,
That's right. It's not in the Hebrew Bible.
not in the Hebrew Bible.
Because it's not in Hebrew.
Right,
That was
yeah.
it. Yeah, the Jews had no trouble with that. It's a simple criterion. If it's not
But
in Hebrew.
It seems like some of the concepts in here about watching what you do with graven images and all became very much a Protestant issue during the Reformation.
Yeah. The Protestants used a lot of these texts against Catholics.
Yeah.
And, things like relics and images and all that. Calvinists particularly. I mean, what are they doing with all these statues in their churches? They say they're just reminders of God, but we see them weeping at them and all of that. We don't believe a word of it. They're worshiping these. And the same thing with Mary, but Mary was much more untouchable for most Protestants. And she certainly was for Muslims. So yeah, there's an easy road, I think, from this to iconoclasm. Get rid of the images entirely. God is invisible. Have a church that is utterly plain, and you hear God's word and pray to the invisible God. I always found it striking, particularly in Switzerland, to go into cathedrals that were Catholic medieval cathedrals and see this beautiful building with nothing in it. Everything has been stripped off. The architecture is the same perfection, but all those niches had beautiful sculptures in them and things like that. But it certainly delivers the message pretty clearly.
Why did Switzerland do that? Why did Switzerland do
Well,
that?
they became
very
Because of the king?
No, very Protestant.
Calvinist.
Yeah.
Calvin, yeah.
Oh, Calvinists took it all out?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But there are Catholics in Switzerland.
Oh sure.
I mean,
Oh, the Catholic cathedrals in Switzerland still have all this.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But actually, the Calvinists got the best cathedrals and stripped the insides of them. Now, this is probably something else we should do in the Pope course, the iconoclastic heresy, which was influenced both by Muslims and by Catholics who feared that image venerating was idolatry, really.
When the Orthodox broke away from the church, part of their concern was, didn't the Eastern Orthodox have not idols, but
Icons.
Icons.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
icons.
That wasn't the reason for breaking away. I mean,
that was or was not?
was not.
Oh, okay.
No. The breaking away, well, we'll talk about in that course if you're around for that. But the breaking away was built up to for a long, long, long time. Relations got worse and worse and worse and worse. And then it was really a pretty little thing that finally tipped it.
Okay.
A doctrinal point. If you ask what was the doctrinal issue between the Eastern and Western Church, was the Holy Spirit generated through the Son or from the Son? I mean, you say, oh, come on. You mean we're going to divide the church in half over a preposition?
Right.
It's all hard to
But
explain
yes.
anyway.
Of course, yeah. I mean,
Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
But that is the doctrinal issue. But they were looking for one.
Yeah.
And this was kind of, for the Greeks, the straw that broke the camel's back. They're condemning something that we revere in our interpretation of the Trinity.
But what about the Pope issue?
Well, the Pope lost the Eastern Church at that point.
I mean, they didn't.
But he'd been losing it for some time. And, you know, relations between Western Christianity and across the Bosphorus were not good. I think I mentioned to you before the cheer that went up when Islam invaded Constantinople, I guess it was Istanbul by then. The cry was, far better the turban of the Prophet than the tiara of the Pope.
Wow.
So we'll take the Muslims anytime rather than that guy. Great slogan, and it says something. And in fact, they did pretty well with the Muslims afterwards. It was a pretty amicable relationship. And many Christians were in Muslim courts. But it shows what the feeling was. And then in the Crusades, of course, that's something else that's got to be in the Pope courts, the Popes in the Crusades.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. You know, one of the Crusades, they were always going off course. You know, we're there to liberate the Holy Land, where the Muslims let any Christians go anyway. You couldn't go to the Holy Land. But we're going to take it back for Christendom. But they were always going astray. A lot of them went astray even in the Rhineland and said, well, we're all armed here. We're not sure we'll ever make it to the Holy Land, so let's kill Jews in the Rhineland. And we had massacres of Jewish towns in the Rhineland by these guys who were supposed to be going, liberating Jerusalem from people who weren't imprisoning it anyway. And then another crusade went off course and went to Constantinople, a Christian city, with a Christian patriarch, and massacred Christians in Constantinople for plunder. So the, you know, better the turban of Mohammed the Prophet than the tiara of the Pope is quite understandable. I mean, you could, those bumper stickers sold like wildfire.
Sometimes when you hear the history, you understand the reaction.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I mean, you know.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
I'll go back to the Exodus thing. We have a few minutes after that. But I thought this bit on the idols was too important. And we get a funny little piece of Hellenistic cosmology at the very end of the book, chapter 19, verse 18 and following. The elements change places with one another. As on a harp, the notes vary the nature of the rhythm, while each note remains the same. No one knows quite what that means. It can't, I mean, that doesn't make sense yet. So, note must be mistranslating something. This may be clearly inferred from the sight of what took place. For land animals were transformed into water creatures, and creatures that swim moved over to the land. I mean, this sounds kind of Darwinian. And, you know, Greek science, Greek speculative science was very rich at this time. So you wouldn't have any trouble hearing that kind of thing. But he's given it another turn. Fire, even in water, retained its normal power. Water forgot its fire-quenching nature. So all these natural things behave unnaturally. Flames, on the contrary, failed to consume the flesh of perishable creatures that walked among them. Nor did they melt the crystalline, quick-melting kind of heavenly food. Manna? Who knows? Now the very last verse, for in everything, O Lord, you have exalted and glorified your people, and you have not neglected to help them at all times and in all places. Some people think that's added on later just to give it the right ring of conclusion. No. Okay, chapter 11, wisdom prospered their works, and by the hand of a holy prophet Moses, they journeyed through an uninhabited wilderness. Through the very things by which their enemies were punished, this is 11:5, they themselves received benefit in their need. And that's the water and the fire and all that kind of thing. 10, you treated them, your people, as a parent does in warning, but you examined the ungodly as a stern king does in condemnation. So God smiles at his people even when he's telling them to stop it, but he frowns at the other guys. 13, when they heard that through their own punishments the righteous had received benefit, they perceived it was the Lord's doing. Now, it's very unlikely they perceived anything remotely like that. But the idea is this is all to convert them, to convert the Egyptians, which you don't find anywhere else. In all the other texts, the Egyptians are just plain bad. We got out of there. Although it's interesting to see all through Hebrew history, they were running back to Egypt whenever they were in trouble anywhere else. 23. But you are merciful to all, for you can do all things, and you overlook people's sins, so that they may repent. For you love all things that exist, and detest none of the things that you have made. For you would not have made anything if you had hated it. How would anything have endured if you had not willed it? So that universal beneficence of God is a theme of the book. 26, you spare all things, for they are yours, O Lord, you who love the living. For your immortal spirit is in all things. Again, a much later development, which sounds, almost Christian and post-Christian. The indwelling spirit. Those who lived long ago in your holy land you hated for their detestable practices, their works of sorcery and unholy rites, slaughter of children, feasting on human flesh and blood, etc. And 11, it was not through the fear of anyone that you left them unpunished for their sins. Who will accuse you for the destruction of nations that you made? So you weren't too hard on them. Neither is there any God besides you whose care is for all people. Again, you don't find that in the Bible much.
No.
15b, deeming it alien to your power to condemn anyone who does not deserve to be punished. So much for the, kill them and their children and their sheep and their wives. So a much more advanced sense of ethics. Wow. Although you are sovereign in strength and you judge with mildness, and with great forbearance you govern us. And then through such works you have taught your people that the righteous must be kind. So God being kind is an exemplar for all of us. We too should be kind. Okay, I think that anything else I would want to do, I don't have time to do. But I think you've got the main distinctive traits of the Book of Wisdom, and I think you can see why I want to read it. I think it's clearly a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. You can see the meaning in it.
Yeah.
And not only the New Testament, but the New World, the New Europe, the Greco-Roman world. And this is probably written in Alexandria, well, certainly written in Alexandria under Roman rule. So it's Alexandria and the folks there are Egyptians, but it's ruled by Rome. This is certainly after the.
And written in Greek.
And written in Greek, which was, well, that was the language they used, yeah. Yeah, that was the lingua franca of the day, and that's why he used it, and probably wanted, you know, non-Jews to read it too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.